Namaskar and good evening. Welcome to the Bombay Management Association's Friday Fundamental Series. This evening, we have the pleasure of having with us on this platform Bosco de Mello, who is the founder of Conscious Development. We'll get to know more about him when he is introduced by my colleague Shripad. But all I'd like to say is the session title today itself should give you an idea of what a storehouse of knowledge we are going to have from this session by Bosco. Navigating a hypercomplex world, the power of paradox, is a session which we are all here to learn from, interact from, and gain some wisdom from Bosco de Mello. I'd like to welcome him on behalf of Bombay Management Association. Thank you so much for readily agreeing to do this interesting webinar for us on the digital platform. Welcome once again on behalf of Bombay Management Association.
Thank you, Professor Mani.
I want to welcome. I'd like to request my colleague Shripad Ranade on the executive committee of BMA, who introduced us to Bosco de Mello, to do the formal introduction. But I'd like to take a minute to share with you that Shripad is here today, not only doing the honors of introducing Bosco de Mello, but he's taken a few precious moments of his time to celebrate his birthday with us this evening. So all of us, can we say many happy returns of the day to Shripad? We could give him a nice thumbs up as a smiley. You could clap for him virtually and have a great evening, Shripad. This is something that all of us here in this room wish for you. On that note, as I welcome you on behalf of Bombay Management Association for this Friday Fundamentals program, may I request Shripad to please introduce Bosco and set this program rolling. Over to you, Shripad.
Thank you, Professor Mani. Very nice of you to wish me and to make my day, as it were. I would rather be here than anything else. For two reasons. One is that I love the subject, and the second is that Bosco is a dear friend, and therefore it gives me great pleasure. In addition to having the privilege of introducing him, Bosco's journey is quite an interesting journey. He has spent something like 30 years or more across marketing, business strategy, program design, coaching. He has been in leadership positions in half a dozen different sectors. And the client work that he does now is really about creating sustainable shifts. And if that sounds a little bit like coaching, that is because he has a science of coaching psychology degree from Harvard. He's an ICF accredited coach. He also has postgraduate diplomas in marketing and advertising. He has a master's degree from Case Western in organization development and change. And I'm running out of time describing listing the degrees. So I'm stopping there with regard to all the knowledge that he has gained. But what I think is most interesting for all of us here is that he supplements his professional commitments with his passion, which is teaching. And I know that he's a great teacher. He's a visiting faculty at TIS and at many other places. And what he does when he works through conscious development, which is his firm, is that he has a singular purpose, which is to enable individuals and organizations to bridge the gap, as he says, between potential and possibility. Now, usually we hear about somebody helping us to bridge the gap between today's reality and tomorrow's potential and all that. But Bosco says potential and possibility, and he speaks about the power of paradox. So as a fellow ICF accredited coach and as a friend, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Bosco. Bosco, over to you. Tell us all about the power of paradox and how it's going to help us to navigate this world, which we are finding it quite difficult to make sense of. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Amitabh. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Professor Mani, for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure and good evening to everyone who's made it to the webinar. I'm looking forward to the time that we have together. And this topic of the power of paradox is something that's very close to my heart. And it's especially important in the times that we find ourselves in, because we're not going to forget 2020 for some time to come. It's kind of burnt itself into our memory. But it's also been a time of great learning. It's put us on a steep learning curve, and many of those lessons are something that we won't forget for a long time. One of the things it's thrown up for us is how the paradoxes that we confront on an everyday basis can make the difference between poor leadership and good leadership, between poor strategy and great strategy, and poor outcomes and good outcomes. And that's what I thought it would be relevant to share with you today. So, which is why I've titled this webinar as Navigating a Hypercomplex World, because that's the nature of the world that we find ourselves in, and how we can leverage the power of paradox in these times. Over the course of the time that we have together today, which is about an hour and a little bit before we go into Q&A, there are four broad things that we'll cover. One is we examine our primary mental models. We understand the nature of change, understand what is paradox, and lastly, look at this phenomenon called the polarity lens, which is a framework that I work with, and it kind of goes through all the work that I do, whether it's consulting or coaching or strategy or organization development, and how we can leverage it to navigate leadership and the organizational challenges that we face today. I want to start with a story that I find very relevant to the times that we find ourselves in. Some of you may have seen this this story. Kind of it was doing the rounds on the internet some time ago. But let me it bears repetition here because it makes the case for the conditions that we find ourselves in today. This is a bridge called the Choluteca Bridge in Honduras, which is a small country in South America. Now, this bridge was originally built in 1930 and then rebuilt in 1996. And the Honduran government rebuilt this bridge in 1996 by employing state-of-the-art architects from all over the world, because Honduras is a country that faces a lot of natural weather kind of conditions, harsh weather conditions, especially hurricanes. And knowing that at some point in time this bridge is going to face very severe hurricanes, they wanted this bridge to be a testament to how Honduras was, in that sense, able to bring in the best kind of capability and engineering from across the world. So they had the best architects, and they built this bridge. And as you can see from the, it's quite a sight. It's quite a beautiful looking bridge to look at, and it was quite a signature landmark for the achievement for the country. And sure enough, just 2 years after it was recommissioned, that is in 1998, Honduras was hit by a Category 5, the highest category of hurricane, called Hurricane Mitch. And Hurricane Mitch devastated the country. And roads were wiped out, buildings were damaged, and every other bridge in Honduras was destroyed. However, this bridge, the Choluteca Bridge, stood its ground and survived in near perfect condition. So it was quite an amazing achievement, or at least it should have been. There was only one small problem, which was that even though the bridge stood its ground, the hurricane caused the river over which the bridge ran to carve a completely new path which no longer ran under the bridge. So that's right, the bridge no longer stood over the river, making it essentially useless. So the bridge is essentially an excellent metaphor for the constantly changing dynamics of markets and business, the times that we find ourselves in today. Regardless of how technologically advanced the bridge was, the designers of the bridge couldn't anticipate the future conditions under which this bridge would operate, even knowing that eventually a hurricane would hit Honduras. So it demonstrates to us how the simplest of assumptions, in this case, the location of the river, may prove to be incorrect. And sometimes even the most successful innovators are unable to consider how markets and behaviors of consumers will change and invalidate their assumptions. This metaphor not only kind of looks at, is representative not only of natural calamities, but also of business. And one great example is Microsoft. The it's the best fit for this metaphor, because for over 2 decades, Microsoft, by collaborating with hardware manufacturers and embedding Windows into their machines, became the dominant operating system. It held a near monopoly on PC operating systems. So essentially, if you look at the metaphor, it built the most successful bridge, which was Windows, over one of the largest and fastest growing markets, which is the PC market. And the PC market in this metaphor is the river, over which the bridge that was built was Windows. And they enjoyed this monopoly for over 2 decades. And then the internet hit in the early 2000s, which dramatically reduced the lock-in that Windows enjoyed. More importantly, mobile came on the heels of the internet, which soon became capable of handling many of the capabilities of the PC with added benefits like geolocation, etc. As a result, the computing market, which is the river, shifted out from under Microsoft. And what worked well in the PC era didn't transfer over to this new paradigm. So Microsoft saw it coming, but essentially it could not predict the forces that would dictate competition in the mobile era. So while they recognized the threat, like the architects of the bridge, the threat of an eventual hurricane, and they tried to build a solution, which is they bought Nokia's mobile business, they tried to launch their own mobile phones. It didn't work. So it wasn't that the people at Microsoft were incompetent or blind to the rising importance of mobile, but they assumed that the dynamics of the mobile market would follow those of the PC market. So it's not that they didn't recognize the threat, it was that they were still operating from a Windows-centric viewpoint of the world. The real problem was that the landscape had changed, and Microsoft was too locked into Windows to build for that new landscape. So it's no surprise that Satya Nadella, when he took over as CEO of Microsoft, had to essentially forsake Windows and look at building new bridges in cloud and services. And this can happen to the best and the brightest and some of the largest organizations in the world. So it's a hallmark of what we call the fourth industrial revolution, which is the digital revolution, where the fusion of technologies is blurring the lines between what is physical, what is digital, and what is biological. And in essence, complexity has given way to hypercomplexity. And the transformations, the disruptions that we see today are vastly different from the ones that we saw earlier in terms of scope or velocity or systems impact. And these disruptions are hard to comprehend even for the most well-resourced organizations on the planet. So in essence, the nature of challenges itself has changed. We used to work with for a long time, for over 70, 80 years, we worked with what we can now call tame problems. Tame problems are issues that can be clearly defined and causes can be easily identified. And they're complicated problems, but they can be solved. And the solutions exist and can be found and implemented fairly quickly. And once they're implemented, the resolution is definitive. So while they are difficult problems, and there is a solution in sight, so people are receptive to tame problems because they stretch the comfort zone, but we can find an answer. So essentially, the tame problems are skill set related because the way to deal with them was to acquire newer capabilities. And now in the last you can say the last 3 decades, increasingly the nature of challenges that we are facing are what we can call wicked problems. Wicked problems are vastly different from tame problems because the issues themselves are difficult to define and the causes are hard to pinpoint. They are complex and they're unsolved. You can't solve these problems because no real solutions exist. What we require is new ways of looking at things, changes in perspectives, new discoveries, etc. And when we think we've resolved the issue, there's a new issue that comes up. As you can understand, people are uncomfortable with wicked problems because they shatter the comfort zone. And the way to deal with wicked problems is not just to acquire new skill sets, but actually to start seeing the challenge differently, to start seeing the landscape differently. So these are essentially mindset related issues. And there's a huge gap between the two. What works so well in terms of skill sets and being able to deal with challenges by acquiring new capabilities is inadequate when the landscape itself changes. For a moment, think of what I'm putting up here on screen and say, which of the problems that I'm showing you on screen here are examples of tame problems? So for example, solving a complex algebra equation, or devising a strategy to beat a chess grandmaster, or you expect 10 people to show up for dinner and 30 people show up, and or sending an astronaut to the moon and bringing her back safely to Earth. Which of these are examples of tame problems? And feel free to put into the chat box if you like. So the correct answer is that all four of them are examples of tame problems. So while they're not easy, they can be fairly complicated, but there is a solution in sight. A solution can be found. Now, in contrast, if you look at the five bullet points on screen and say, which of the following are examples of wicked problems? Say a profitable business that's also good for the environment, uh, creating affordable and high quality healthcare for all, rewarding performance in organizations while also encouraging loyalty and reducing attrition, COVID-19, helping refugees while respecting the interests of our own population. Which of these do you think are examples of wicked problems? So the answer is all of them are examples of wicked problems. COVID-19 is the latest example because we don't know the origin of the problem. There are many stakeholders involved, many differing viewpoints. There's no definitive resolution in sight. Just when we thought we had a resolution in form of the vaccine, we find that there are new strains of the virus which have emerged which are resistant to the vaccine. So essentially, one cycle is closed and a new cycle is opened. So just as we see COVID-19 as an example of a wicked problem, most of the major challenges that we face today are in the nature of wicked problems where there are no clear answers. And the existing solutions and what worked so well previously for us are no longer capable of providing a solution in these times. So we don't have the luxury of responding to hypercomplexity, the time that we find ourselves in, with our usual ways of thinking. We've always relied on human intelligence to find the answers. But what we see now with COVID-19, for example, is that human intelligence in its current form can no longer understand the intricacies of the system, nor predict its future behavior. So if we want to have the results that we've never had before, we need to start thinking in ways that we've never thought before. Essentially, we need new ways of seeing the world. Then the question becomes, so given that this is the nature of things, how do we ensure that we are future ready? Not knowing what the future is going to throw, what curveball it is going to throw to us. How do we become capable of navigating hypercomplexity and an ever-changing landscape? In other words, how do we make our thinking equal to the complexity of the environment? How do we make strategy competitive and sustainable? How do we become, for example, more valuable partners to our clients? While we have no control over how the world is evolving, what we have control over is our mental models, how we think, how we see the world, our unique perspective. The question therefore becomes, what is our operating mental model and how are we seeing the world? As the beautiful saying goes, if you think it's possible or not possible, you are right. Or as Jonathan Livingston Seagull says, Richard Bach, rather, says in that book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, argue for your limitations, and sure enough, they are yours. So we have to learn new things. We have to learn new ways of navigating this world, of, of seeing and examining our mental models. And the harder part of this is unlearning, to shed old patterns, to make ways for the new ways of looking at things. So let me ask you this. What's our natural response to something that's complicated? Most people would say our natural response to something that's complicated is to simplify, because simplification makes life manageable and predictable, which is why we have apps for everything today, from reminders about meetings to exercise to finding restaurants, organic food, you name it, because they help us simplify and manage the complexity of our day-to-day life. And this response is evolutionary. It's biological as well, because as neuroscience tells us, it has to do with how the brain functions. You see, the brain likes certainty, and consequently, it hates unpredictability and chaos. Which is why when you're going to do something that's outside of your comfort zone, outside of the known, you may feel nervous or even afraid. Neuroscience shows us that our primary need is to feel safe, certain, and avoid pain, because safety keeps us alive. So certainty makes us feel secure and helps us sleep at night. See, the green lizard on the screen represents the amygdala, which is also called the reptilian brain. It's the oldest part of the brain, 2 million years plus. As man evolved over time, this was the first part of the brain that started developing. And given the conditions at that time, the primary focus was to stay alive, not to be eaten by a wild animal or get kind of affected by nature or the elements. So over a 2.5 million time span, you can imagine how powerful this part of the brain has become. And this part of the brain is what controls our fight, flight, freeze response. The monkey represents what we call the limbic brain. That was a more recent evolution of the brain. The limbic brain is also called the emotional brain. It's the emotional center. And it's restless and keeps our thoughts hopping around, which is why it's also called the monkey brain. And the top part of the brain, which is more recent, you can say recent, like just about 50,000 years old, is the thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for higher order processing, like, for example, creativity, reasoning, logical thinking, etc. But the gateway to the brain is first and foremost the amygdala. And it's important to understand this, because the paradox is that what our brain wants, which is safety and certainty, is not what our brain needs. Because the amygdala is so powerful, it drives our need for certainty and safety, because it wants to keep us alive. But preference for safety and certainty creates an imbalance where we shut off ourselves from our own potential. Because the opposite of certainty is curiosity, being open to something new. So when we're certain, or we drive for certainty, what we're doing is we're submitting ourselves to a life with little or no exploration. But to grow, we have to build new neural circuits, which means doing things differently or doing new things. And much of what makes our brain happy leads to errors and biases and distortions. So for example, our brain is happy when we are around people who think like us. Now, if we keep giving in to those impulses, guess what happens? We constantly look for or constantly choose people who think like us. And what happens then? As a consequence, we start excluding people who don't think like us. And what do we get? We get groupthink, we get homogeneous thinking, we get everybody thinking the same way. And that kills innovation, that kills creativity. Now, if you look at the times that we are in, which we also call the knowledge economy, what's the one thing that provides businesses competitive advantage and keeps them alive? And the answer to that is innovation. In the knowledge economy, the only thing that keeps organizations alive and gives them competitive advantage is innovation. And innovation means disrupting routine thinking. Because innovation means getting answers that you haven't had before, which means you have to think like you never thought before. Innovation is the workplace expression of evolution in that sense. Just as organizations that don't innovate become irrelevant, unless we evolve our thinking, we will soon become irrelevant. If we don't evolve voluntarily, we will be forced to evolve. There's an interesting book called Thinking Fast and Slow by this Nobel Prize winning psychologist called Daniel Kahneman. And he put forward this theory that we have two broad modes of thinking. System 1 thinking, which is fast thinking, and system 2 thinking, which is slow thinking. Now, as system 1, if you look at system 1, as the name goes, fast thinking is quick, it's instinctive, it's unconscious, and it's emotional. It comes from essentially our hardwiring, things that we already know, which are stored in our memory, in our muscle memory, in our minds, coming from patterns that we observed in the past, things that we know, belief systems that are operating within us. So it's almost like thinking without thinking. System 2 thinking, which is slower thinking, is more deliberate, effortful, and complex. Now, fast thinking accounts for 90% of our thinking. So you can imagine that most of the time when we're responding to a situation or when we're thinking, it is based on instinctual responses, things that we know, things that we've observed in the past, things that are hardwired into our system. The other way to look at it is that while the brain is only 3 pounds of matter, it accounts for over 25% of the energy consumption of the body, which is why if you spend, if you're in a session which requires a lot of thinking, you emerge from it feeling very tired, right? Because it's taken a lot of energy to process that brain power. So what does the brain try to do? It tries to conserve energy. And the best way to conserve energy is to do most of our thinking in terms of fast thinking, where you don't have to think too much, you don't have to process too much. Rather, you rely on the instinctive, stuff that you already know, the hardwiring, so it preserves your energy. So consequently, what happens is fast thinking accounts for about 90% of our thinking. So in essence, we tend to apply the same kind of thinking to all kinds of problems. Now, why is that important to understand? You see, you can see how predictability, certainty, and safety are built into system 1 thinking. And therefore, we tend to apply the same kind of thinking to all kinds of problems. Whereas system 2 thinking, which drives innovation, is the kind of thinking that we need in organizations. And the higher we grow in leadership, the more is our responsibility to drive system 2 thinking. Now, system 1 thinking, since it accounts for over 90% of our thinking, quite naturally, it becomes a predominant mode of thinking. And this is characterized by what we call either or thinking or problem solving thinking. It's also called right-wrong thinking. This is right, this is wrong. This is yes, this is no. If this is the answer, this is not the answer. If we go this way, we don't go that way. What it does is that it creates simplistic frameworks where problems, if there's a problem, the problem has to be solved. And the problem has to be solved usually by making a decision, either this or that. Problems are to be solved, challenges are to be overcome. And this mode of thinking, this either or thinking, the foundations of it are laid in our education and our training. In schools, the focus is to find the right answer because the right answer is what gives us the marks. It's what gets us promoted to the next standard. It's what gives us the rank in class, for example. So our education system is built for finding the right answer. It is built for conformity and predictability so that we could move large numbers of children through the system. The focus is not on exploration, but on finding the right answer. So we've become hardwired over time to have a preference and make the choice and look for the right answer. And if we find the right answer, then all other answers are the wrong answer. In school, creative thinking was something we learned on the side, if at all it happened. Can you think of a time when you were told that there may be more than one right answer, or that I don't want the right answer? So when you come to think of it, that's how cultures are also built, around conformity and the right way of doing things. So over time, as a result of this hardwiring, as a result of our time in school and the foundations laid by our education and training, either or thinking has become our default mode of thinking. Now, if you look at the statements on the screen, which of these reflect either or thinking? Either we give the client what she wants or we lose the deal. If we want the most economical product and we want it fast, we have to compromise on quality. If we don't put in money to build a new school, the quality of education will drop drastically. I can complete this report well if I overshoot the deadline, or I can produce a substandard report to meet the deadline. All these are examples of either or thinking, because you can clearly see the alternatives. And what you are being encouraged to do in the way that these statements are presented is to make a choice. You can either do this or we can do that. We can have this or we can have that. If we have this, then we cannot have that. Some more examples of either or thinking that you would have come up against. Statements like you're either for it or against it. Take it or leave it. If I go to sleep on time, I won't be able to study for the test. If I want to study humanities, it has to be Yale or Harvard. They're all presented in ways which are, you have to make binary choices. Now, it's important to recognize that either or thinking is useful. It's very important because it helps us solve problems, and problem solving is important in organizations. At some point in time, all of us would have put problem solver in our resumes. It's also fast. You find a solution quickly. You keep things simple. It doesn't overtax the brain, and it provides closure and consensus very importantly. Provides closure and a sense of movement so that people can say, okay, we've got a decision, now let's move on. So it's extremely important. However, people often use either or scenarios, sometimes to force a decision, even when you need more time actually to make a decision, or to create an illusion of surety, or to resist change or new possibilities. And lastly, to avoid stepping into the tension of a dilemma. Because what if there's no clear right and wrong? What if they look like two right answers? Now that's a tension. That's a tension that the brain doesn't want, because it means stepping into uncertainty, stepping into something where there's no clarity. So what we tend to do in situations where we tend to see tensions or dilemmas is to move away from it. And how do we move away from it? By making a decision and saying, okay, I'm going to go with this one and let's move on. So a key insight to remember is that when we resort to either or thinking as a predominant strategy, while it is important, it results in a zero-sum game. There's a winner and there's a loser. There's a 1 and there's a 0. The options are limited to only 2 alternatives. And the possibility of obtaining both options is gone. And consequently, the possibility of innovation or creativity is limited or eliminated. Must remember that either or thinking does not recognize the interdependence between two ideas or values, because it's one or the other. So, and then there is something called the dilemma. This either or fallacy, this primary operating system that we use for all our thinking, is sometimes also referred to as the false dilemma. A dilemma is nothing but a tough choice. When you're in a difficult situation and each option looks equally good or bad, you're in a dilemma. It's derived from the Greek word for double proposition. And a false dilemma is a statement that assumes an either or situation, when in fact, there is at least one more additional option available. So for example, if you make a statement like, John opposed an argument against Buddhism, so he must be a Buddhist. What happens when we succumb to either or thinking for most of our thinking is that we develop a kind of a tunnel vision. And this tunnel vision makes us see all problems through the same lens. And we make a decision by choosing the better alternative. Scientists also call this phenomenon mental myopia, or a one-size-fits-all approach. We may think that we are being decisive or providing clarity, but in reality, we are simply subject to a limited mindset. Now, as Maslow said, if the only tool we have is a hammer, every problem tends to look like a nail. Now, to let the brain make new connections, we have to free ourselves of this tunnel vision. And this includes negative emotions such as anger and frustration, because these feelings flood the brain with a hormone called cortisol, which blocks our ability to be creative. We literally can't think creatively, which is why when we're stressed, most of the time we tend to make these either or choices. I have to make a decision, because that's a way to relieve the stress. Now, if we recognize this, we recognize that while either or think is important, it is also driving most of our thinking, which is why we get the results that we get. If we want different results, we have to change our thinking. So how do we build our mental model beyond either or thinking? We do it by building our muscle to navigate this phenomenon called paradox. So as Einstein said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. We have to see the world differently. And paradox is a new way of seeing the world around us. In learning to navigate paradox, what we are doing is that we are reducing our reliance on system one thinking and bringing about more of a balance or an equitable distribution between system one and system two thinking. We're relying less on our hardwiring and our preconceived ways of looking at things and giving way to more thoughtful effort, to more creativity, to the possibility of more innovation. I want you to look at these statements on the screen and think about them for a moment. Less is more. The only constant in life is change. To have peace, we must have war. Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. Followers make a leader. Go slow to go fast. What do you notice about them? You see that there are ideas that seem contradictory on the surface. Less is more. Cruelty, you have to be cruel to be kind. Go slow to go fast. There are two ideas that look contradictory, but when investigated further, they prove to be true. So paradox is nothing but two ideas that may look contradictory, but they are in fact true. They may even seem illogical. But when you investigate further, you see that the contradictions hold the key to something bigger, to a larger meaning. The individual parts of the paradox, less, more, slow, fast, cruelty, kindness, they are true in and of themselves. For example, less and more are perfectly legitimate standalone ideas. Yet putting them together in the same sentence creates the contradiction. And this contradiction gives us meaning and insight. So essentially, paradoxes create a new way of thinking and being. They're about wholeness, about the bigger picture. And they invite us to discover new answers. Paradoxes also trigger system two thinking and therefore create the possibility of richer outcomes than simply making a choice between one alternative or another alternative. And a key feature of paradox is interdependence. Even though the two ideas are strong and correct in themselves, like less and more, slow and fast, it is the interdependence between the two that generates the creativity and the larger picture. One without the other has very limited power and possibility. So while a paradox is contradictory, it is also unifying. And a paradox will always hold more possibilities than an either or option. Now these these paradoxes that I put up on the screen, these sentences are easy to identify because they're pre-packaged, they're obvious. But paradoxes don't always present themselves in easy to identify ways or easy to identify forms. Let's look at some of the paradoxes that we experience and see that do we really see them as paradoxes? So, example, here's a situation that you might have come across. Misha tends to micromanage people on the job. She comes across as pushy and it makes her team uncomfortable. It's hard for her to change because she feels if she isn't hands-on, the quality of work will suffer. Now, what should we advise her? Or we look at the fact that in organizations, our leaders are often transactional and goal-oriented. They need to connect with their people, but emotional intelligence training hasn't worked. They're concerned that people will take advantage of their warmth and empathy. So now what do we do? Or we see that Mark is a people's person, but the concern is that he's too soft. This may affect his growth to the next level where it's all about delivering results. On the other hand, Mark doesn't want to lose his edge because that's what makes him successful. So what should he do? Or in organizations, we see that we have a family-oriented culture where we take care of our people. But we are losing our edge in a business where people make the difference. If the culture needs to change, we need more performers who deliver results. How do we get that? Or we talk a lot about working as a team, but there's little collaboration. Teams have become silos, and this competitive spirit is really damaging us. We need to change this. Some of you would have recognized some of these challenges that you might have come across in the systems in which you work. The question is, can these challenges be resolved by making choices or trade-offs between the alternatives? So for Misha, for example, can her situation be resolved by making this either or choice between being hands-on and hands-off? For the leaders, can the situation be resolved by making a choice between being task-oriented and empathetic? Can Mark's dilemma be resolved by changing him into a demanding taskmaster? The answer is no, because these are paradoxes. These are not either or problems where we can choose one value or one competency or one goal or one objective over the other. And yet we do, because they cannot be solved. These paradoxes are not something that can be solved by linear thinking or tackling one demand at a time or making a final decision between two alternatives. The shift is not from this to this, either this or either that. So system one thinking or either or thinking does not work here. So what works? So let's look at this figure on screen. Some of you would have seen it. Anybody who's done a management course, most of the time you would have come across this very popular paradox figure. It contains, as many of you would know, an old woman. You can see the outline of the old woman. She's looking down. And it also contains a young woman. She is looking slightly to her right and slightly upwards. Okay. Now, the important thing about this is that what you see is that both sides exist. One is not more important than the other. One without the other means you only know half the picture. If you can only see the old woman, but not the young woman, you're only seeing half the picture. Choosing one over the other is making a false choice. So if I ask you to choose what is this a picture of, and you say this is a picture of the young woman, it's a false choice because then you're not recognizing that there is also the old woman in the picture. And most importantly, the old woman and the young woman look like opposites. They look contradictory, but they actually complement each other to complete the picture. One without the other is incomplete. Now let's look at, this is a classic paradox, right? And a classic paradox where like go slow to go fast, cruelty and kindness. The old woman and young woman, they're contradictory, but they need each other to complete the picture. Similarly, paradoxes show up in all facets of life. If you look at organizational focus, we tend to make this either or choice between innovation and efficiency. If you look at product strategy, the focus on cost looks like the opposite of focus on quality. We look at management style, we believe that we can either be task oriented or people oriented. If you look at values, traditional family versus modern family. If you look at personal style, we believe that we can be candid or we can be diplomatic, and so on and so forth. These paradoxes show up as chronic and recurrent problems, even though we think we've solved them by making a choice. What we've done is, most of the time, we've applied system 1 thinking to challenges that require system 2 thinking. And when we do so, we often misdiagnose paradoxes as either or problems, and we experience fixes that fail because they want problems to solve in the first place. But we've treated them as cause and effect, which is another form of either or thinking. Now, we may think that we fix the problem with task-oriented leaders by advising them and putting them through training to be more relationship-oriented. But the shift will be marginal, if at all, and they'll go back to the original state at the first time that it's not working. We make a choice between focusing on innovation versus focusing on efficiency, or we take a call on focusing on cost at the expense of service, and we think we resolve the dilemma, only to find that in focusing on one versus the other, we've unwittingly created a new problem for ourselves. If you look at leadership, most assessment results usually look the same year after year, which should not be the case, right, logically, because after assessments, you invest in training, you invest in coaching, etc., etc. You would think the needle moves, right? But the needle hardly moves, and this shouldn't be the case. So why is that? It's because change is very, very hard. There's a joke that the only people on the planet who like change are babies with wet diapers. The rest of humanity hates change because change represents something new. Change represents going out of our comfort zone into something that could be potentially chaotic and uncertain. And the brain, as we saw earlier, prefers certainty and safety. So change is hard. And the fear and uncertainty that come with the prospect of change create the resistance, because our brain is wired for continuity and predictability. So if the brain doesn't have continuity and predictability, it finds it difficult to change. That's the paradox. And people resist change because they believe that they will lose something that they value, or fear that they may not be able to adapt to new ways. And that fear and uncertainty makes them hold on to whatever it is that they value. Change is not a simple from to switch. It's not about logic, because most of our decisions are emotional. We like to believe that we are logical beings and that we are rational in our thinking, but all our decisions are emotional. And whenever we try to change a strength or a behavior, especially one that is dear to us or that we hold very closely, it tends to trigger this either or all or nothing thinking. There's when we try to switch, do the switch from to switch, it triggers survival and safety instincts. And when people feel threatened or unsafe, they switch from using their rational brain to the emotional brain. It's an evolutionary instinct. And we have to recognize that we are not as logical and rational as we would like to think. We tend to underestimate how hard, how difficult it is to carry out any change. And the stronger the strength, the stronger the behavior, the stronger the value, the stronger is our fear of losing it. And therefore, the stronger the resistance and the need to hold on. And yet, in a world that is complex, in a world that is demanding new behaviors and new competencies from us, we have to change. We have to unlearn. We have to let go of the past. Now, if letting go of the past or something that we value is going to be so difficult, how are we going to do it? We can address this complexity by understanding the impact of paradox and how to leverage the paradox, more importantly. And when we reframe paradoxes beyond either or problems, we produce superior outcomes. And the polarity lens, which I mentioned at the start of this session, is a way in which we can harness the power of paradox. What is the polarity lens? The fundamental premise of the polarity lens is that it allows you to see more. And when you can see more, you can do more. It allows us to see and engage with paradox, thus allowing for greater possibilities than just either this or either that, either right or wrong, this way or that way. We use the term paradox and polarities interchangeably, and they're nothing but interdependent pairs of strengths, competencies, values, or goals that look contradictory. Now, remember the old woman and young woman? They're interdependent and they look like the opposite of each other, old woman and young woman, but they actually need each other to achieve a greater purpose. Less and more, cruelty and kindness, old woman and young woman, yin and yang, left brain and right brain. They look contradictory, but they need each other to achieve a greater purpose. And polarities are also called dilemmas, paradox, wicked problems, contradictions, dual strengths, dichotomies, etc. The nature of polarities is that they're always positive or neutral. They always come in pairs of strengths, values, objectives, goals, or competencies. They're always interdependent, and very importantly, like the old woman and young woman, they look like opposites, but they actually support each other. And a polarity contains 2 points of view, both of which are true. It gives us a perspective where we don't have to play one against the other. We can recognize the value of both. The difference between problems and polarities is that problems have one or more right answers that are independent, because if this is the answer, everything else is not the answer. If there is the fill in the blanks, there's only one answer that goes into that slot. If it's a match the column, the arrow from one side comes to only one place on the other side. And if that is the answer, everything else is not the answer. Whereas a polarity can have 2 or more right answers that are interdependent. Problems are finite and have an end point. Polarities, the tension is ongoing. The tension, there's no resolution to the tension. And in problems, a solution exists. In a polarity, no solution exists. Problems can be solved by making the either or choice, whereas polarities are leveraged by a both and approach. We need this and we need that. If you look at some of these examples of polarities, head, heart, day, night, yin, yang, compete and collaborate, strategy and execution. While the latter two, compete looks like the opposite of collaborate, strategy looks like the opposite of execution, they're actually polarities which need each other, and we'll see how. They show up in organizations across any function, competency or role, like leadership, managing teams, business strategy, conflict resolution, diversity, cost management, etc. And the paradox of polarity thinking is that we need both. We need either or thinking because we need to solve problems, and we need both and thinking for more creative solutions. And both of them are critical thinking skills. I'm not here to say that either or thinking should be replaced with polarity thinking, because that would just be another form of either or thinking. We need both. If you look at leadership, we cannot grow to become outstanding leaders until we embrace the behaviors and attitudes that are most uncomfortable to us. So while as leaders, you may have certain strengths or values, if you really want to become successful as a leader, as the landscape changes, as you interact with more people, as the level of complexity grows up, you have to embrace behaviors and attitudes that also you may not easily be inclined towards. Because the most effective leadership practices force us to integrate the unthinkable. And if you look at effective leaders and organizations, they have this ability in common, which is that they navigate paradox by being able to hold opposing ideas, and rather than reject them, they integrate them into a larger one. So instead of trade-offs, instead of an either or choosing one or the other, they resolve the paradox in the form of a new idea that contains elements of the opposing ideas, but one that's superior to both. So let's look at an example of how the polarity lens helps us leverage the wisdom of paradox. Okay? Let's look at strengths, for example, because each one of us, we've been taught to leverage our strengths because those strengths are the reason for our success. Right? So right from the time that we recognize what we're good at, we've been taught to nurture that. But can our strengths become a weakness? I want to leave this thought with you as we go forward, and this many of you will recognize this metaphor of can your strength become a weakness. So I'm putting up on screen uh, some strengths. Okay. Some of you may identify with some of these. Some of you may say, okay, I have, my strength is not here. I have some other strength, which is fine. This is only for the example, so we can see how we can leverage the strength. So spontaneous, task focused, visionary, candid, uh, having control, being directive, confidence, being process oriented, strategy or analytical. These are all strengths. The one that I identify with a lot is the strength of being candid. So let's see how this works. This is a simple polarity map which we use in to be able to leverage the paradox, the strengths paradox. Okay? How it works is it's a simple grid, and it has two poles on either side. On the left side, I pick the strength that I'm most comfortable with, which is candid. So I really value the strength of being candid. It's gotten me great results over time. So if I see in the upper left quadrant, if I put down what are the advantages that I get by being candid, the advantages are I express my views freely, everybody understands them clearly, uh, what I think and where I stand. I'm respected as a strong and forthright person. So it has certain advantages. Now, what happens if I overuse this strength of being candid? I start getting some downsides, some disadvantages. And what are those? These are some of them. People start getting uncomfortable with my directness. I come across as harsh. People stay away from me and they don't express themselves openly. I'm seen as a my way or a highway leader. Now, when I start getting this feedback, I start seeing these downsides and disadvantages. It makes me uncomfortable. I don't like it, right? So I think to myself, okay, I'm starting to see this and I'm not feeling good about it. I need to do something. What do I need to do? So I tell myself, okay, maybe I need to be more diplomatic. Diplomatic looks like the opposite of candid. Right? So now if I put diplomatic on the other pole and say, what are the advantages that I get out of being diplomatic? It has some advantages, some clear ones. I make my point without getting into conflict. I'm seen as approachable and easy to get along with, and I create respectful space for different perspectives. Now, if I overuse this strength of being diplomatic, I will get some downsides as well. Is that I don't have a definite view on anything. People don't trust me because I don't speak clearly, and I'm seen as ambiguous and weak. So clearly, both have upsides and both have downsides. Now, what is it that I really want? If I'm working in an organization, I want to have presence and influence. That's my goal. Right? What do I want to avoid? I want to avoid alienation and stagnation. Now, if I look at any of these strengths in isolation, is being candid without being diplomatic, is it getting me to where I want? Or for that matter, is being diplomatic without being candid, is it allowing me to have presence and influence? Clearly, I need to be both candid and diplomatic in order to reach the goal that I want, which is presence and influence, and to avoid what I don't want, which is alienation and stagnation. So the polarity map, how does it do that? What it says is, what we need is how do we get the upsides of being candid and diplomatic, and how do you avoid the downsides of both these poles? So rather than looking at candid as the opposite of diplomatic, I see, okay, I need to be candid and diplomatic. How do I do that? Action steps. I can plot action steps to say, what are some of the actions? simple measurable actions I can take to continue getting the upsides of my preferred strength, which is candid? And what are the steps I can take to start getting some of the upsides of this interdependent strength of being diplomatic? And what are my red flags that will tell me that I am overusing either one of these strengths? Okay, so I put down these. For example, early warning signs could be that the body language of the person across me shows discomfort, or I'm chosen not to represent the firm with external stakeholders, or I'm getting negative feedback from my colleague about who are witnessing my interactions. On the other side, on the diplomatic side, colleagues are not comfortable expressing their views or stating problems. Or at the end of meetings, there's lack of clarity or confusion about what is being done next. So now I can see that while my preferred strength is being candid, just relying on the strength of candid alone, I'm not going to get to my objective. So being candid and diplomatic, seeing it as an and, is what will allow me to leverage this paradox. The paradoxical wisdom of the polarity lens is that it's a wisdom organizer. I may have this in my mind, but now when I put it down on a piece of paper, I'm able to see it more clearly. It recognizes that any strength that is over leveraged will lead to downsides. It also recognizes that change is not about logic. If you tell me that you need to be, as a leader, you're seen as too candid, you need to be diplomatic, my either or mind will say that, which means that if I have to be more diplomatic, I have to give up being candid. Now that creates fear in me because being candid is my strength. Why would I want to give up my strength? So there is this tussle in the either or mind. But from the polarity lens point of view, which is the and point of view, I say I can be candid, I can continue to be candid, and I can be diplomatic. So I don't have to give up one in order to get the other. Okay? So it recognizes that this paradox of being candid and diplomatic is what will get me to my goal. So from the polarity perspective, the paradoxical perspective, you don't have to give up something in order to gain something. I don't have to give up my strength to acquire another strength. It's a both and. So it starts with reassurance and creates a certain psychological safety that I don't have to give up something. And when I feel safe, I will be open to exploring a different kind of behavior. So we are often aware of our weaknesses and often blind to the downsides of overusing our strengths. So any assessment will make us aware of our weaknesses, but they don't warn us of when we are overusing our strengths and when those strengths will turn into weaknesses. So we fail to notice when hands-on turns into micromanaging, when empowering turns into abdicating responsibility, or when confident turns into arrogance, or when candid morphs into being harsh, or daring becomes risky. We don't see that because we were taught to use our strengths. But over time, any strength that we overuse, or from an organizational perspective, like this case of an all-green tracker. So an organization that I worked with where they were so strong in delivery that their trackers were all green. They were delivering everything that their client wanted. But their contract didn't get renewed the next year because while they were delivering, they were relying on their strength of delivery. The client also wanted people who would bring new thinking to the table, who also would push the client's own thinking, bring more innovation, more proactiveness. But they were so focused on their strength of delivery that that strength over time became their weakness. So when organizations focus on strengths, we have to be careful that those strengths don't turn into a strengths trap. A strength overuse becomes a weakness, a value overuse becomes dogma, a virtue overuse becomes a vice. And the either or mind makes the shift feel difficult because the stronger the value of strength, the stronger is the fear of losing it. But the both and mind, when we look at it as a paradox, the polarity lens tells us that we can have one and we can have the other. I'm going to skip these for want of time, but if you look at some of the finest organizations in the world and some of the most effective leaders, like this person, Jorgen Nordstrop, he led Lego out of bankruptcy back into one of the most profitable companies in the world. His management and leadership mantras: take charge and let go. Quite paradoxical, right? They look like the opposites of each other. Satya Nadella was able to turn around Microsoft by bringing in empathy without giving up on result orientation. Now, empathy and accountability or result orientation look like the opposite of each other. But empathy and result orientation allows leaders to be supportive while also demanding results. So what polarity thinking does is it enables leaders to transform how they manage complexity and also build competitive advantage. And some of these dilemmas that we see in our heads, we see them as either or. We can either be liked or be respected. We can either hold people accountable or we can show empathy. We can compete or we can collaborate. We can't really choose one or the other because they're actually paradoxes. They're polarities to leverage. You have to be liked and you have to be respected. You have to compete and collaborate. You have to be planning focused and implementation focused because they're both interdependent pairs. I'll quickly give you an example of how it shows up in business strategy, where we normally see polarities in adversarial terms. We see cost as the opposite of quality or innovation as the opposite of efficiency. If you look at Singapore Airlines, this is a great example, and there's a Harvard Business Review article. They leverage this paradox of cost management, which looks like the opposite of service, right? Cost and quality, usually seen as opposites. But because they leverage cost management and service excellence simultaneously, they not only manage costs well, but they are also the most awarded airline in the world. And there was a 10-year study that was done on Singapore Airlines, which concluded that the ability to balance opposing poles and thus transcend paradox affords Singapore Airlines its sustainable competitive advantage. And if you map it on a polarity map, this is what it looks like. They leverage this seeming paradox of cost and service, and that's how they get the results. They not only manage costs well, but they also provide the best service in the airline industry. If you look at Amazon, efficiency is normally seen as the opposite of innovation. You can either be efficient or you can be disruptive and innovative. But Amazon is efficient and innovative at the same time. If you look at Tesla, it is good for the planet and good for business. The conventional thinking was what is good for business is not good for the planet. Right? But Tesla has shown that this need not be the case, and today it's the most valued car company in the world. So many organizational dilemmas of stability versus change, centralized versus decentralized, data focus versus people focus, customer focus versus profit focus, for example, are actually paradoxes, and which need to be seen as an and rather than an or. So do we manage and leverage polarities naturally? We all manage multiple polarities to some extent. We may not even be calling them polarities. However, because of lack of awareness, we don't manage all polarities well. In fact, we may not be seeing many of them, and the ones that we don't see affect our individual and leadership and organizational effectiveness. And we tend to project the values we dislike onto other individuals and groups and stereotype our own values as if they have no downsides. So to recap, polarity thinking is a 21st century competency. It applies to any strength, individual or organizational, competency, value, objective, goal, or strategy. And it helps us avoid this one size fits all, this either or thinking, bringing either or thinking to all kinds of challenges. And what it does is makes, as you can see in the case of Singapore Airlines, more robust and sustainable strategy, wiser decision making, and extraordinary outcomes. So you can, with the polarity lens, you can fight today's battles and reinvent for the future. You can take care of yourself and of your people. You can care for employees and care for customers. And leaders who navigate paradox, they can be, you can be a tech savvy humanist, you can be a strategic executor, you can be a globally minded localist, you can be a humble hero, you can be a high integrity politician. So the next time you ask yourself, should I focus on achieving tasks or should I focus on building relationships? The answer is yes, both. Should I be empathetic or should I hold people accountable? The answer is yes, both. And should I be candid or should I be diplomatic? The answer is yes, both. So that's what I had to share with you today about the power of paradox and being able to leverage paradox so that we go beyond this, the myopia of just either or thinking, because paradoxical thinking allows us to create richer outcomes and make strategy more successful and avoid the downsides of either strengths that are overused or values that are overutilized or goals that are overemphasized on. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand over to you, Professor Mani. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you, Bosco. That was indeed very profound sharing. So many of the ideas which you presented to us seemed very, very intrinsic, seemed very, very complex. But at the same time, you demonstrated beautifully through several examples as to how one could bring about the change if one did decide. I must compliment you on the very, very patient way of explaining these concepts, because as you know it better than me, people love change but don't want to change. And I think that's where the entire paradox begins, as you have so ably explained. There are a lot of questions in the chat box, and I'm going to take some of them so that we can engage in a meaningful discussion. Would you like to take a break for a cup of water or something before I start sharing the questions?
Yep, I'm good to go.
All right, wonderful. In this entire process of managing paradox, human nature tends to always focus on who is right and not so much on what is right. How does one actually win this battle? Could you share some of your wisdom?
I think the fact that we recognize that the emphasis seems to be on who is right rather than what is right itself, this awareness itself is a starting point. Because we tend to, one of the slides that we put up there was to say we very unconsciously we tend to get into stereotyping. I'm right, you're wrong. My way is the right way, you're right, your way is the wrong way. Right? The moment we start from that perspective, it's going to be binary. It's my way or your way. But what if I, with an awareness that it need not be binary. Like Nandan Nilekani said beautifully in this book that I was reading called The Opposable Mind. He says, whenever I'm presented with an either or option, my first question is, why can't we have both? Because what that does is just changes the thought. Rather than say, how do I choose between this or that? Won't I say, why can't we have both? It sets people thinking along a very different kind of trajectory. So if we recognize that sometimes what happens is when two people are very, very embedded in their ideas, that embedding gets translated into a personality issue. You are pig-headed. I am flexible. Why can't you listen? Why are you being difficult? But if they recognize that actually it is a strength that I'm holding on to, if I am very structured in my thinking and I have a problem with somebody who's very flexible, what's really going on here is that even with good intention, I'm holding on to a strength that I value. That person is holding on to a strength that they value. Neither one is good or bad. But if we see that structure need not be the opposite of flexibility, that we need both, it opens up a dialogue to say, okay, how can we get the best of both? How can we leverage the best of both these strengths? So then the dialogue is not about I'm right and you're wrong, but say, how do we make sure that we can leverage my strength of being structured and your strength of being flexible without getting into the downsides? So we remove the personality from it and say, okay, what are people really holding on to here? What are they valuing? What is the fear for them? Right? And let's deal with that. Right? So it kind of changes the nature of the discussion.
I appreciate what you're saying, and I think that's a very meaningful suggestion on the way ahead. The next question pertains to something which all of us are aware of. A lot of this kind of paradoxical thinking is perhaps inculcated in us right from school down to college upwards. So it becomes a situation where we are often focusing on black and white, and shades of gray are always looked down upon. How
Yeah.
do we bring about this transformation?
That's exactly the problem, because we're trained, it's hardwired into our system to look at things in black and white.
Absolutely.
And most of the time when people come to us to present a challenge, also they present it in black and white terms. Now, if we don't have awareness of this phenomenon of paradox, or the fact that it can be so powerful, we will continue to operate in the same way. But if we know that there's a way in which we can transcend this binary thinking, right, then we first and foremost stop looking at every situation as a binary either or. And rather, like Nandan Nilekani says, are these the only options here? Or is there another way? Is there something that we can do which is, which calls for a different kind of thinking? Why should one be a trade-off against the other? So it's a conscious, in that sense, you're consciously changing your hardwiring. You're consciously changing the way you approach a problem. And that has to be intentional, because if we rely on our old ways of thinking, we'll always go back to patterns that we knew. And then we'll get the results that we'll get. So then we can't say, why aren't we getting new results? It's because we're applying the same kind of thinking. So if we consciously push our people, if you next time somebody approaches you with an either or, instead of giving a decision and saying this or that, say, okay, what if we thought about it differently? What if we didn't have this? What if we wanted both? How would you get the best of both? And get our people thinking differently. You'll find that it's not easy. I'll tell you this, because as leaders in organizations, people come to us for decisions. People come to us for speed. People come to us for closure. So as leaders, we feel that we need to give closure. We need to give decisions. We need to be decisive. And here you have, if a leader who says, I'm not giving you a decision on this or that, I want you to go back and think about it. Right? Now you have to have that strength. There's a very successful leader in Procter & Gamble. His name was A.G. Lafley. Now he changed the whole trajectory of Procter & Gamble's growth. One of the things he would do is he would say, in any meeting, if all my senior leaders agree on a solution, he would stand up and say, well, this gives me the clearest indication that this is not the solution. So I want you to come back to me after a day, having thought about this, and say, how can we do this differently? So the first thing is, don't succumb to that immediate need to say, okay, I need to take a call based on what is presented to me. Try it. If we try it, we may get some kind of different kind of thinking.
All right, I'm delighted to welcome in our midst for this session some of our past presidents, very senior participants, Mr. Ernest Fernandez, Mr. Indrapal Singh. Thank you for being with us, as you very often join us in this learning journey. Mr. Fernandez, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Professor Mani. I thought these practical examples given by Mr. Bosco de Mello were very fascinating. Mr. de Mello, would it be that decisions, economic decisions, are more paradox thinking is more applicable to economic decisions? But when it comes to ethical and social decisions, paradox thinking has its limitations. And I was just thinking as an extreme example, one of our greatest leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, was he a polarity thinker or was he a problem solver thinker?
So one of the slides that I put up said that the paradox of polarity thinking is that you need both. You need either or thinking and you need both and thinking. So there are situations in which you need a binary approach. Integrity is one of them. Since you mentioned integrity issues, integrity, you can't have a halfway house. You can't have, this and that. Integrity is binary. Someone is cheating the organization or someone is doing something unethical. It's a clear, either you accept that behavior or you don't accept that behavior. It's not a both and. So there are situations where we need a binary approach. If I say, do I need a Dell computer or do I need a MacBook? It's a binary decision. I can't have both and. So there is ample room in our decision making for this either or a binary thinking. But when that becomes our primary way of approaching all kinds of problems, then we start having that binary approach to whatever is the problem that we face. But when you look at it paradoxically, we say we need both. We need problem solving. We need that either or thinking, because there are some problems where we need quick decisions. But there are an equal number of problems, and most of the challenges that we face today, whether it's social challenges or economic challenges or healthcare challenges, they're increasingly in the nature of and. They're increasingly in the nature of paradoxes, which cannot be solved by saying we'll do this or we'll do that.
Thank you.
I have one of our participants, Rakesh Barucha, who has a question. Rakesh, would you like to unmute and please speak up? And then we can move on to Indrapalji. Go ahead, Rakesh.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Rakesh, please go ahead.
My question is whether it will dilute the value or the righteous path.
I'm sorry.
Whether the way of thinking will dilute the value system or the righteous path.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Okay, so I'll read it out for you. What concern Rakesh has expressed is, if we were to follow the approach that you had suggested, will it perhaps dilute value systems or the search for a righteous path?
Well, as I said in the answer to the previous question, I'm not suggesting that both and thinking is the only way of thinking. I'm saying you need both and thinking and you need either or thinking. You need both. What I'm presenting to you is an additional way of looking at challenges. And where I'm coming from is the fact that most of the time, because of our hardwiring, because of our educational training, because of the way we've been taught to think, most of the time we are approaching all challenges with just one kind of thinking. What I'm presenting to you is another option. You can say there is another way of also looking at it. So it need not come in the way of the righteous path or thing. As I said earlier, there are problems like, for example, integrity issue, where you use a clear, this works or this doesn't work. There's no room for both and in that, right? But we don't apply that both the either or thinking to all kinds of problems. So in fact, if at all, I think it only helps us get into, helps us navigate the challenges that we face, whether it's finding the righteous path or not. It doesn't come in the way, because all it's saying is that let's broaden our thinking and not restrict ourselves to only one way, only one lens, only one kind of, like with blinkers.
I guess we understand the perspective you're sharing. Well appreciated. Indrapalji, over to you.
Yeah. Mr. Bosco, it's extremely clear to us that what you presented today is the result of a very deep study of psychology and Kahneman's work and other very important but not well understood concepts and theories. So thank you so much for simplifying them and making them understandable to people like us. And I fully agree with what you said, that we require more and thinking. And the absence of and thinking, we are seeing huge lot of problems amidst us. For example, there's a farm issue that is blown out of proportion, is a classic example of the absence of and thinking. And similarly, there could be several amongst us. So I think that the world is getting more complex. This tyranny of either or should be minimized, and more of and thinking should be brought about. And I had seen very good example of that in what Toyota Motor Company has done. For example, many years ago, the same issue, cost versus quality. Americans were arguing, can we have higher quality cars at lower cost? Their answer was no. Toyota defeated that paradox and said, yes, we can have very high quality cars at low cost. And the answer was that they eliminated waste from the processes, and they broke the paradox. So I suppose breaking of that paradox in a creative way leads to huge fortunes which are hitherto unexplored. And I'm so glad that you are teaching about this kind of new way of looking at problems, wicked problems especially. And that's really wonderful. This is one of the finest expositions that at least I have come across on this kind of difficult subject. So thank you so much for sharing with us. And I'm sure you will agree with this, that we require more of and thinking. I think BMA is conducting so many programs, 100 odd programs during the pandemic is also that kind of thing. People said that who would come, who will attend. So digitally we have managed to get, in the absence of, in the presence of lockdown, adopting digital means break that difficulty. That how can we bring so many people to come and learn week after week. So these are the kind of creative solutions that are possible if we adopt the and paradigm.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Mr. Singh. You have very valuable comments, and I completely agree with you. What we're seeing in the world today, unfortunately, is more and more polarization. We're seeing more and more polarized views. And our media also has a great role to play in it, because most of the arguments that are presented in the media that we see force us to take sides, force us to be binary in our thinking. Right? And so we end up getting polarized. What we need is more of and thinking without giving up on all thinking, because that is important. Not everything is an and solution, but today, because there is so little of it, is why we face so much of polarization. And any strength that is overutilized, any value that is overutilized, when you over focus on it, it is going to give you downsides, which is where the and thinking becomes important. So we need both. Jim Collins, his book Good to Great, is something that most people would have read. In that book, he says we have to end the tyranny of the or and bring in the genius of the and. I have only one small disagreement with that, because he's saying replace the or with the and. And what I'm saying is you can't replace one with the other, because just another way of or thinking. You need both. You need or thinking and you need and thinking.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful, very well expressed, and I think that's one of the most simplistic, profound statements, that we need the or thinking and we also need the and thinking. Thank you so much, Bosco, for all the time and energy that you spent this evening with us. It was indeed a very, very profound session, and Indrapalji rightly put, based on so much of research, readings that you have done over so many, many years. We sincerely appreciate the time that you spent us, and assure you that starting this moment, we will try to put to practice, at least somewhere, sometime, the concept of and, instead of focusing on energies only on the concept of R. On behalf of BMA, Professor Mani, thanking you for all your time and the wonderful session that you conducted for us. As per BMA Parampara, let's put on our videos for a group photograph. It will serve as a good memory of the time that we spent this evening learning from Bosco de Mello. everyone to please put on your videos. We have our efficient BMA Secretariat team, Lakshmi, Supriya, Oindrila, Deepa. They not only do the Secretariat work, but they have mastered the art of digital photography over the last 11 months that BMA has gone onto the digital platform. So all of us, please put on your videos, flash on your best smiles. I also noticed that Professor Guru Prasad is here from JBIMS, who's also our faculty for some of the programs of BMA. Welcome, Professor Guru Prasad. Nice to have you here in our midst. And may I take this 2 minutes to share with you that the session next Wednesday is going to be on digital health. That's something that India is experiencing, and there are lots of debates about it. We have the managing director of GE Healthcare, Shravan Subramaniam, who is going to come and share his views on this entire idea of digital health. Next Friday, we have another interesting session on management lessons from the Bhagavad Gita and ancient Indian wisdom. We have two speakers with us. The first one is Dhruv Chatralia, who is going to log in from London. He's an attorney there, but spends all his time on researching Bhagavad Gita and finding out how one could take the profound lessons into managing organizations. And the second speaker is a national award winner, Harikatha exponent, Srimati Vishaka Hari. She is going to focus upon the true wisdom that we can derive from ancient Indian texts and how we can use it to manage people effectively. A Jugalbandi of sorts next Friday. A very different experience is what I can assure you on the BMA platform as we continue to deliver our Wednesday Wisdom webinars and Friday Fundas. I get a confirmation from my colleagues that they have completed capturing all our smiles. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. All my colleagues on the executive committee and the past presidents of BMA, thank you again, Bosco de Mello. We look forward to being in touch with you. Good evening, everybody. Have a great and safe weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you.